I've cleared my workbench today so that we can have an honest discussion about knives, and I, as a bladesmith, will tell you everything I think you should know as a consumer. Okay, so there's a lot of things to consider when you're making a knife, but in broad, there are four big categories that will probably enlighten you a little bit in terms of the things I think about when I'm about to make a blade and choose the materials to get that job done. Okay, so the first bucket of consideration in terms of the knife being used to make a blade is going to be the steel's ability to acquire hardness through heat treatment. There are different scales to measure hardness. The most common, I think, for blades is probably the Rockwell scale, and there are tools that you can use to get a really precise measurement in terms of how hard a steel is after heat treatment. And for a kitchen knife, for instance, sometimes you'll see the hardness listed, especially if it's a custom knife. And you'll see that hardness in terms of an actual number show up as something in a kitchen knife, let's say between 60 and 63. And then if it's a hunting knife, then maybe it's a 58. And then if it's a sword, maybe that's a 57 or a 56. So those are small increments, but they actually do make a difference in terms of other properties to the steel that are a reflection of the hardness. So the second bucket in terms of considerations for the steel is going to be edge retention, which is obviously correlated to hardness. So edge retention is the ability for the steel to actually hold that geometric shape of that final edge. So in a kitchen knife, it'll be somewhat like this in terms of the final edge. And as you wear it down, it sort of flattens from the top and becomes less sharp. So the steel's ability to hold that edge is edge retention, and different steels hold edges for longer than others. Generally speaking, if you have a steel that's really good at holding an edge in terms of edge retention, on the flip side, it'll actually be harder to sharpen. So there's a middle ground there oftentimes. The third bucket in terms of considerations I think you should be aware of is one we'll call toughness. And that's sort of defined in a few different ways, but generally speaking, let's call it in terms of being able to take a beating. So whether you're bending it or whether you're hitting it against something, its toughness is its ability to not break, not chip. The harder the steel oftentimes in terms of hardness, again, there's a correlation between all these categories, the easier theoretically it'll chip depending on the steel. So toughness, kind of increases by the lower hardness that the steel actually has. So think of all these four major categories as sliding bars, and as you move one down, oftentimes another one goes up. The last major category, I think, for your consideration is probably corrosion, or its ability to resist corrosion. So that really comes down to two major categories that are most often used for knives, one being stainless steel, one being a carbon steel. So carbon steels have properties that are more attractive, in my opinion, and stainless is more attractive to the consumer because it's obviously less maintenance. The ability for it to resist rust is a lot higher than it would be in a carbon steel knife. I have three knives in front of me, two are mine, one is not. I'm going to take those four categories, those four buckets of considerations, and apply them to the knives here and just sort of discuss the pros and cons. So this first knife is my knife. It's a laminated Damascus steel knife. It's 9 inches. The steels are 15 and 20, which hardens pretty well, but also has decent anti-corrosion properties. And the other steel is 01, which I find sharpens really well, holds an edge, and is actually generally a tough steel. So the properties within both these steels are, you're trying to put stuff together that goes well together, but also complements one another at least a little bit. On all carbon steel knives, especially Damascus knives, I shouldn't say all carbon steel knives, but on Damascus knives, often what happens is you want to reveal the steel. And the way you do that is you put it in acid at the end. You put it in acid, it'll eat away at the steels at a different rate, and then you kind of wash that down, neutralize it, and then the pattern is revealed from there. Over and above that, you can take a few extra steps to add a layer. In a production knife, that might be something from anodized steel to applying a lacquer to it. Although they're probably inert for the most part, I always think about food leaching. So if I'm applying a patina to a knife, which generally speaking I mostly do, then that patina is going to be non-toxic from beginning, basically guaranteeing that it's going to be inert at the end. And so if there's any leaching into food, it's not going to be toxic. This knife in particular is what's called a full tang knife. So the steel from the back of the blade all the way through the handle can be seen. The handle material here is actually local maple. The maple is then stabilized, so I put it into a vacuum chamber, inject it with resin, and that's something that's actually good because what it does is it basically seals all the pores within the knife, preventing any food microbes or just moisture from penetrating and staying into the material itself. And then I put a burnt finish on it actually. And that burnt finish, what it does is on the surface layer, really basically, especially with the resin, really seals the material completely. And so that's kind of what this knife is. It is going to be more maintenance than a stainless steel knife would be for sure. And I'll go through some of the things you need to take into consideration when you're choosing between, let's say, the broad category of stainless and carbon. So this second knife is also mine. Same steels as the first, just in a much more elaborate pattern. So more time spent forging, more time spent manipulating the steels. Now, the reason it's important for you to, when you're buying a custom knife, for you to be assured that the person who's making the knife actually makes the steel for it is because pattern welded steels are pretty widely available online through manufacturers in countries that aren't able to certify the origin of the steel. So, you know, there's a lot of Damascus knives sold, but the steels within the knife itself don't have a certified origin. So you're often getting a subpar product from a steel perspective, which, you know, like wheels on a car, this is kind of where it all starts. There are bladesmiths, few of them, who do pattern welded stainless steel, which is actually very difficult to do. It's kind of a step up in tooling and effort and material and time. And that's also, that needs to be reflected in their price. So the ability to buy a Damascus stainless steel knife exists, but you're just gonna have to pay a lot more for it. Now, this third knife is not mine. This is a production stainless steel knife. One of the main differences here is the fact it has an integrated bolster, so the steel actually carries through into the handle, which is nice to have actually. The handle scales are, I have to guess, something like G10, synthetic material. Ergonomically, it's whatever. Nothing is refined on this knife. Even the edge, doesn't have a clear secondary bevel. Don't get me wrong, it came sharp out of the box. It works if you're cutting something into two, but this is one of many, this is one of one. So all the ergonomic considerations I take into account, reducing sharp lines, making it comfortable in the hand, making sure it's actually balanced and does what it's supposed to, has a perfect edge on it when I put my final edge. These are all things you're not gonna find here. But by all means, this works as a knife. It just comes down to what you want out of your knife. So we're gonna go through each knife and review the 4 sets of considerations and try to figure out where these knives fall. First one is going to be the stainless steel production knife, which in fact is a Mesen knife, which I know very little about. It's made in China and they've done quite a bit of marketing, as it turns out. I went to the manufacturer's website to try and get a better read on the product itself. It was a little bit vague in terms of some language and a little fast and loose, but one thing they did list was the hardness, which was listed, I think, between 56 and 58, if I'm not mistaken, which is okay. That'll do. But I wasn't seeing that with the tools I can test for hardness. So I looked a little further and I actually found a Wired magazine review on this knife, which means that they did a good job doing their marketing to get on that guy's radar. But what the reviewer did is he actually gave the knife to a couple bladesmiths like myself to kind of dig in a little deeper. And what they found was kind of what I came across, in that the hardness was really closer to 52, I think is where it came out for me. I think they ranged it between 51 and 53 in the article. Contacted the manufacturer to sort of ask what was going on with the knives. Now the fact is they probably heat treat hundreds of these knives at a time. And it's hard to control all those variables. I do one knife at a time, and I check it on the way out to make sure that it's actually hard to the point that I want it to be before I continue. That's almost impossible to do, I think, with a high level production like this knife would have. So hardness not being what it's supposed to be, and it being actually in fact quite low for a kitchen knife, that's going to affect edge retention, the second factor. And edge retention is already, I'm seeing a little bit of flat on the edge, which is just to say that it's wearing itself out pretty quick. The knife itself, though, is probably going to be tough because the hardness is so low. So I guess that's a plus. And although I'm seeing a little bit of change in coloration in the steel after a few weeks of use, it's pretty good in terms of resisting corrosion, so that's a plus there. But overall, the Wired article listed this knife as a 3 out of 10, and I'm not sure I could give it any more than that. But it's an interesting read, so if you are actually interested in this knife, or perhaps you already own one, then maybe that Wired article is a good read for you too. So the next two knives are both mine, and they're both the same steel. So I'm just going to review the list once for both knives, and we'll start with the hardness. The hardness of these knives, by the time I'm done heat treatment, falls into the 60 to 61 range. And that's pretty hard, but not so hard that it'll be really easy to chip out. Japanese knives kind of have a tendency to do that. They get a really high hardness, sometimes as high as 63 or 64 even, but they tend to chip out. So if you hit a bone or an avocado center, the likelihood of your blade remaining intact is not as good. Edge retention on these blades of mine is actually pretty good. But when they do need to be sharpened, on the flip side, they do actually take that sharpening pretty well, so it doesn't turn into a mountain of work to maintain the edge. Toughness, 01 again, lends itself to being a tough steel, which is just a property of that steel. So that also helps in the fact that it won't chip out all the time or very easily. And the last factor being corrosion, or its ability to resist corrosion. It's definitely not the high water mark that a stainless steel knife would have. So if you run mine through the dishwasher, it really won't look the same. But with proper maintenance and good habits in terms of use, that really isn't an issue. And the other properties that are definite benefits over and above what you would find against, let's say, this production stainless steel that we're measuring against today, I think definitely outweigh the fact you can't throw it into a dishwasher. So when you're considering getting a knife and a custom knife is in the realm of possibilities for you, the first consideration you should probably take into account is whether or not you're going to be able to be mindful enough in the kitchen to use and appreciate a carbon steel knife. So if you can't break the habit of throwing it in the dishwasher, or keeping it at the bottom of the sink, or you can't institute the habit of wiping it down after use, these are maybe reasons not to get a carbon steel knife. Whether or not that's a custom carbon steel knife from someone like me, or whether or not that's a Japanese carbon steel knife, which sells a lot more than I make. But even those knives have their quirks and considerations. Here's one I don't think most people know. There's actually quite a few of Japanese carbon steel knives that are production, but their production is actually really pretty good quality. What they do on their carbon steel knives, which are mono steel, so not Damascus or anything kind of pattern related, they'll put a thin layer of transparent lacquer on the knife, which you as a consumer are actually expected to know and remove before use. Now, the lacquer, I think, when it dries and hardens, is actually inert. But once again, even if it is inert, and that is something you don't know about or forget or don't take off the knife even when knowing, I think is something that'll inevitably leach into the food, inert or not. So if you're in the market for a new kitchen knife or otherwise, I think those 4 considerations are probably easy ones for you to use to determine whether or not a custom knife is for you or if a production knife is a better purchase. And just to clarify, there's really everything in between. You can get a custom-made stainless steel knife. I don't typically make those very often because for me, the end work is a little bit boring. But if you are able to institute the habits required, which are pretty minimal, the biggest one basically being keep it out of the dishwasher, and can accept the changes over time that come with a carbon steel knife, I think you'll be pleasantly surprised. And just a few final words on what never to do with any knife. And general rule of thumb is use it for its intended purpose. So if it's a kitchen knife, don't use it like a sword. Don't use it like a screwdriver. Don't use it as a parenting tool while disciplining your children. Just common sense stuff. So the 4 things that I think about when I'm making a knife and the materials I'm going to use to make it are the following. The ability for it to get really hard,